Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining us for the Awning Shop and Installation Safety webinar presented by PAMA, Professional Awning Manufacturers Association. My name is Dan Lister with Glen Raven Custom Fabrics, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar will educate attendees on OSHA regulations as they relate to the awning and shade business. We will share some of the most common OSHA citations in manufacturing. We do very much encourage you to ask questions at the end. Note that a survey will pop up automatically when the webinar concludes, and you'll have two chances to complete that survey at the end here of the webinar or in a follow-up email, which you will receive automatically. We value your feedback, and it's really our only way of expanding and improving educational contents to you. So we do hope you will fill it out. We will be placing all attendees on mute throughout the webinar to minimize any background noise. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions function of the GoToWebinar toolbox. You'll see that on the right-hand side of your screen, and then I will moderate the questions at the end of the webinar. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Charles Walser. Charles has a Bachelor of Science in Textile Manufacturing from North Carolina State University. He holds his Master's of Business Administration from University of North Carolina at Greensboro Bryan School of Business and Economics. Charles is a certified safety professional and has over 20 years of experience in EHS. He has been the Director of Safety, Security, and Environmental Affairs at Glen Raven since 2011. Please help me in welcoming Charles. We will now begin the webinar. Charles, it's all yours.
Dan, I certainly appreciate that introduction. And today I'm going to cover a lot of material, not very deeply, but certainly at a level I hope everyone can understand. My objective is hopefully to make you get one or two things from this webinar that you can take back and put into place or actually use after you listen to it. And as Dan said, I certainly welcome questions at the end. But again, thank you for allowing me to do this presentation. I'm going to start at the place where OSHA requires record keeping. And what records do they require employers to keep? And the answer to that is, if you have more than 10 employees, you are required to keep what we call an OSHA 300 log. And if you have less than 10 employees, you don't have to keep a log. Of course, you're still under the OSHA regulations and the general industry regulations for your site. But if you have more than 10, you're required to keep a log. And on that log, you are required to record the recordable incidents. And I'll get into the definition of that. And we do not have to record first aid, and I'll get into a definition of that. So the OSHA 300 log is the log we must keep. And then they have what's called an OSHA 300A. All the 300A does is summarize and the 300 log. And you just add up the columns and you put it on a sheet of paper. But the one different thing about the annual summary is it must be signed off by the highest official at a location. So the manager, plant manager, whatever your supervisor, whatever your highest site official, just to say that you agree that that's the instance, how many days people were on restricted or lost time, that type of thing. You also have an additional form that's called a 301, and that's basically information like you get in the instant investigation, like who, what, when, how, why, where, and you put it on this form. And again, all these forms would have to be available for OSHA if they were to come on your site for a random inspection. There's some other reporting requirements that employers must do these days, and I hope you don't have these next two. Employers must report a workplace fatality within 8 hours. they have a telephone number, or you can go online and you have to report that fatality within 8 hours, and of course they'll come out and inspect that injury. Also, employers must, this is new, employers must report an amputation, loss of eye, or inpatient hospitalization within 24 hours. Again, you have to call in and give that information. And this new thing about having to report an amputation has really put OSHA in the bind. They've gotten a lot more calls on that than they anticipated, I believe. And again, that is why it's important to, if you do have a finger injury, that the note that the doctor writes, it basically states it is an amputation. If it's not an amputation, you do not have to call that in. Here are the forms. I thought you might like to see what they actually look like. The upper left is the actual 300 log, and you can see you just enter the person's name, the date, where the injury occurred, what happened, and then you check over here if there were any lost time days or was it no lost time days, and then you would place the number of days that that person was out of work or working in the restricted type of duty. Now, one on the right is the 300A, the summary, excuse me. Let me go back. Excuse me here. The one on the right here is the summary, and again, you would just add up the columns that you're doing on the 300A, and you put them here, and right here is where you would have the highest official sign. And this bottom one is an example of the 301, and again, it's basically gathering the information like you would of an accident investigation. And again, all these forms would be required if OSHA were to come knocking on your door. Now, you do not have to record first aids, but you'd have to know what first aid is defined by OSHA. And I've got some things written here, and again, this is at a very high level, but using non-prescription medication at non-prescription strength, all that means is if you take 2 ibuprofen, that's first aid. But if you take 4, that's probably not non-prescription strength. That would be considered prescription strength. Using wound coverings such as Band-Aids, bandages, gauze, using non-rigid means of support, using ice and heat, and temporary immobilization devices. All this is first aid, and you would not have to put this on what the OSHA 300 log. OSHA defines a recordable injury down below, and that would be a fatality, a loss of consciousness. It doesn't matter if a person has restricted days, lost time days associated with that. If a person gets knocked unconscious, it is a recordable injury. If someone gets hurt and they can't come back to work, it's automatically recordable. If someone goes to the doctor and they put to him, say he can only lift 5 pounds and normally has to lift 25 pounds, he's put him on restricted duty, so that would become recordable. Or he can't do his assigned job, but he can do another job. He gets transferred another job. That would be recordable. And then medical treatment beyond first aid is recordable. And so the issuance of a prescription is considered medical treatment. So if they get some type of painkiller or some other type of prescription medication, that makes the incident recordable. All these recordable incidents that are work-related are to be put on your OSHA 300 log. I thought you might enjoy knowing what the top 10 most frequent cited standards that OSHA has put out in 2018. As you can see, a lot of these are going to be things that you do as being awning fabricators, especially fall protection. And it's got construction there, and what that basically means is the 1926 rather than the 1910 standards. And so let's say that like in our company, we're under the general industry standards. But if a contractor comes in and has to use fall protection, they're probably considered construction. But it doesn't really matter. Fall protection is very important. It's something that's going to always be looked at by OSHA. And I'm going to go into more detail about that one because I know that's something that you have to do. Hazard communication, that's going to have to do with labeling of chemicals and making sure you train your people on the chemicals that you use. Scaffolding, we know what that is. Respiratory protection. Lockout, tag out, it's going to have to do with locking out your machines when you're working on them. Ladders, powered industrial trucks, that'll be like forklifts, pallet jacks, and things like that. Here again, fall protection again, and this time it's on actual training, machine guarding, and iron-phase protection. And I look at these top 10 things and I say, you probably are affected by all these top 10 things. I would think that each one of you in your shops and then when you go on the jobs and install awnings, that you deal with all these 10 things. It would be something that that you need to mind. This is what OSHA has said is their top 10 from 2018. I always like to say, if I were to talk to somebody on how they should start a safety program, I think the best place to start is to evaluate the hazards at your workplace, and then it's go into job specifics. In other words, each job, and identify and evaluate and then control the existing workplace hazards. And this can be accomplished by collecting information from the workplace, inspecting the workplace, identifying health hazards. When I say health hazards, I mean like fumes, asbestos, silica. These are all health hazards. You have a lot of fumes when you do welding that you got to make sure that the people who are welding are protected. When you have an accident or an incident, as we call it, that's when you learn a lot of what hazards associated in making sure that you investigate those incidents. You can identify hazards with emergency and non-routine situations. Categorize the nature to identify hazards, identify the control measures, and then prioritize the hazards for control. And then I started thinking about your particular job. I bet you need to do an assessment both there in the shop that you work, and then when you take those awnings out into the field, you also need to do a hazard assessment out in the field to make sure that you're not putting your people at risk. And I just pulled a couple of forms that could be helpful if you do not have something like this in place. This is very simple. It's just identifying the task, identifying the hazard, and then identifying the control that you would put into place, and then just putting some verbiage around that. We could say you're having to climb above 6 feet. The hazard is fall. You can control that by providing maybe a scissor lift. If you can't have a scissor lift, you'd have to have through fall arrest system, make sure to have a tie-off point, and give fall protection training. So that would be the control, and then you could list some comments around that hazard. This would be one way to gather your hazards in your area. Another way you can do it is through what we call a job safety analysis, or some people call it a job hazard analysis. And this is what we do within Glen Raven. We break down the job into task, and then we look at that task and we say, what's the potential hazard within that particular task, and then what are we going to implement to make sure that we control that task. So let me just give you an example there. Let's say a fabric roll weighed 150 pounds. The hazard, of course, is back strain or shoulder strains, or those strains would be your potential hazard. The control might be to use a hoist, or control might be to use a two-man team lift. There's various ways that you can control hazards, but you do identify the hazard and you do put the control. And you do this throughout all your jobs and all your tasks. And this becomes a great tool to do training, to keep your people just in constant awareness of the hazards on their jobs, and just really, again, puts those hazards in a very simple form here that you can all begin to train on. Another good thing about having this is that when you do have an incident, you can make sure that whatever happened at the incident, that you had the hazard on the JSA. And if you didn't, you can continually update this JSA. This JSA should be a living, breathing document. It's not something you do one time and you leave it alone. It should be updated as things occur and as new hazards are introduced. From the hazard assessment, the last thing you want to do is to put PPE on people. You want to make sure, if you can, you engineer the hazard out. That would be the best thing to do, is to eliminate the hazard if you can. But if you can't, ultimately you may have to put PPE, personal protective equipment, on your people. That would be things like gloves, a dust mask, steel-toed shoes, and on and on. We all know earplugs, whatever it is. But again, from your JSA, you would identify the hazards, and then you would put in the controls. If that control cannot be eliminated, then you may have to spell out PPE. And this form is a form that you could do that. There's many forms available online that you can go on. They're free. You can get them online and make and apply to your areas. I thought what I would do today is also just go over some general tool precautions that I'm sure that you guys deal with. And one of the main things I'm going to say in every slide is the one in bold at the top. All manufacturer requirements and guidelines must be followed, as indicated in the product manual and warning stickers. So basically, when you get a tool, the instructions or whatever will highlight the requirements and how to use that tool safely. And then once you take the tool out and start using it, the tool itself should have some type of labeling or stickers on it. And again, it's a way to make sure that that tool is being used properly. Hand tools would be things like screwdriver, hammers, chisels, all these type of things. Inspect and remove unsafe hand tools. Do a toolbox inspection. In our company, we have the right to inspect the tools of our people, and we make sure that that they don't use unsafe tools. A lot of people use wrenches for hammers and screwdrivers for chisels and things like that. We want to use the right tool for the right job. And so if they're using pliers for a hammer, we want to make sure that those things stay in good shape. So we do periodic inspections to make sure they keep their tools in good shape. And if they're not in good shape, we make them take them home, or if they're our tools, we take them and discard them appropriately. But we want safe tools in the workplace. And of course, always use the necessary personal protective equipment as recommended by that manufacturer, and make sure you use the tool for what it's intended to do. I just talked about that. When you use a tool, your space around should be kept neat and orderly as possible. Tools should be kept in their designated area and not left out in areas that could pose tripping hazards. And the wooden handles of tools should be kept free of splinters, cracks. It should be kept tied in the tool. So again, just educate your people on what is safe, and when they're not safe, make sure they understand if they're empowered to take them out of use. This is one of our biggest issues within our company, especially within our Tri-Vantage warehousing branch distribution centers, because we cut cloth, we cut plastic, we cut cardboard. We use a lot of cutting devices, so we have a lot of potential laceration hazards out there. So what you want to do is just make sure we use sharp blades at all times. We all know that dull blades pose a safety hazard because the person has to put so much more force on it, and this sometimes can lead to tool slippage. Cutting tools can cause cuts and puncture wounds if they're not handled properly. It's so important that they are inspected also for defects and that they're always properly used. This is the main one. Always cut away from your body, never towards the body. We've heard that since we've been kids, but I don't know why, but people still do that, and we just need to make sure that they're always cut away from the body. We want to make straight, even cuts. We want to make sure that people remain focused and maintain eye contact on the task at hand. We don't want them looking away. We want to make sure that they're watching out for what they're doing. And within our company, if you have a cutting device in one hand, you have a cut-resistant glove on the opposite hand. And that has really helped us eliminate a lot of these lacerations. However, we still do have them. I bet you use the cutting devices a lot in your operations as well. Power tool safety. Again, there's that manufacturing requirement guidelines. Always follow those. When power tools, just make sure good housekeeping practices are followed, and make sure that you get up the accumulation of combustible materials such as dust and shavings when you get through, because there are fire hazards. You don't want those accumulating, and some dust are combustible dust, and you don't want that accumulating on areas, and then you can have a potential for a fire. So that is real important as you use, if you generate any type of residual dust, those types of things, to get it up after you're through. Don't wear loose clothing, jewelry, or dangling objects. Hands and fingers must be kept clear of any blades. Use only the appropriate cutting blades for the task at hand. Make sure they're the right size for the tool, and make sure you wear the protective equipment that's required. And never carry a tool by the cord of the hose. It can pull the restraining device out of the tool and expose wiring, which then becomes susceptible for electrical shock. So you don't want to do that. And we want to keep cords and hoses away from heat, oil, and sharp edges. Again, we don't want that electrical cord to get frayed. Pneumatic tools. Pneumatic tools are wonderful, but they also can be very dangerous. Again, eye protection should be used when using these tools. And I'm just going to go ahead and say, in my opinion, if you work in a maintenance shop, safety glasses should be a requirement for those people anytime they're doing a task in that shop. If they're taking a break or using the restroom, no. But if they're in the shop and they are doing tasks, I believe fire protection should always be worn for these types of people. Hearing protection might be required depending upon the frequency of use. Now, hearing protection is required all the time if you exceed 85 decibels over an extended time period. And that would be something that you would have to measure. But when you need to be wearing ear protection. It's pretty obvious. So just know that probably in some of these cases you need to be wearing ear protection. Depending on the task at hand, as well as the nature of the material being cut, gloves may need to be worn. Now, there's a lot of controversy on whether you should wear gloves using certain tools, because the glove itself can present a hazard. So this is where you would have to read into the instruction manual to see if they would require gloves when using the tool. You don't want the tool to get into the reciprocating blade or into a belt or those types of things. So sometimes gloves should be worn, sometimes they shouldn't be worn. So it depends on the actual tool. You want to make sure that tool's securely fastened to the hose, and we don't want to operate that tool at a pressure above the manufacturer's rating. Again, that will be on the instruction manual. And we want to make sure that hose connecting device doesn't present a cut hazard. Sometimes it can get burrs on them because of the many times that you connect them in and out, and you want to make sure that that's not present. Staple gun safety. I'm sure, again, that you use a lot of staple guns in your operations. Eye protection is a must. And probably head and face protection is recommended. I'm talking about like a face shield type of thing, in addition to eye protection. I can see where there's a lot of hazard there. Hearing protection, depending upon the decibels and how long that person uses it, again, may be required. But we always want to keep our fingers and hands out of the area being stapled. We don't want to staple a finger. And this next bullet point is very important. Pneumatic tools that shoot staples or similar fasteners and operate at pressures more than 100 pounds per square inch must be equipped with a special device to keep fasteners from being ejected unless the muzzle is pressed against the work surface. I don't know if you have older staple guns that don't have this safety feature. It may be the case where you want to get rid of those guns and go to the more up-to-date guns that do have this safety device, because shooting staples across the room is very, very dangerous, as you all know. Well, pneumatic tools must be checked to see if they're fastened securely to the air hose to prevent them from being disconnected. Again, there's always that chance. Always make sure it's tightly fitted. Miter saws and circular saws, again, eye protection, hearing protection, possible gloves. Again, make sure you consult the manufacturer recommendations. And the bottom thing here is sometimes a thing we forget when we use a miter saw. It should be mounted to a surface to avoid it from rocking during operation. You do not want that thing rocking during operation, slip off and cut your arm or your leg or something like that. Always make sure you mount it. Actually screw it into a surface. Now, this slide is showing the guards on miter saws and on circular saws. And again, these saws are showing very up-to-date technology for these types of equipment. You may have older equipment that don't even have these guards in place. I would highly recommend you discontinue use of the old equipment and purchase the new equipment with the proper guards in place. Never perform cuts on small pieces that require a hand to be placed in close proximity to the cutting device. So we have what's called a stick or something that you push through the saw where you don't have to put your finger up through there. To avoid contact with a coasting blade, do not reach into the cutting area until the blade comes to a complete stop. Prior to use, the function of the guard must be tested. In other words, make sure that guard comes back. Fingers and hands must be clear of the area being cut. So make sure that guard, after you finish a cut, comes back into place each time. Reciprocating saws, or sawzalls as some people call them, are very hazardous. Again, wear eye protection, ear protection, also gloves. Again, I would say in this case, gloves would be used, but again, make sure that the manufacturer recommends its use. We don't want the glove to present a hazard. But this is the most important point about a sawzall or a reciprocating saw. You do not want to bind or pinch the blade when making cuts with a saw. Binding the blade may cause the blade to break and possibly jerk the saw from the user's hand. If it does get stuck, cut it off. Cut the saw off and try to get it out. Don't try to get it out while it's operating, because you can break that blade and that blade can fly back into you. There's just all kinds of things that can happen. Fingers and hands must be clear of the area at all times. Drill press, safety. Again, the eye protection is required, and again, gloves should be worn. Again, just consult the manufacturer recommendation. Now, at the point of operation where that arrow is, we call that the rotating chuck, and it must be guarded during operation. I bet several of you do not have that chuck guarded, and that's because that chuck does not come with the actual drill press. In some cases, you have to order that from places like Granger and other places you can get that protecting device. But again, at the point of operation, you should have that guarded. You want to make sure that the bits are inserted and tightened securely. Make sure that your hands and fingers stay clear of the rotating drill. And then this is one of the most important things. You want to make sure that this drill press is secured to the surface to keep the press from walking. In other words, if that drill binds into a piece or a part or something like that, it can make the whole drill press start turning if that base is not secured to the surface. So you want to make sure you go ahead and bolt that in place in the floor or into the cement to make sure it doesn't what we call walk away. Bench grinders. We all have these, and they're very dangerous. And again, ear protection, hearing protection, eye protection, possibly gloves. We want to make sure that the grinder wheels themselves are not damaged in any way. And also, before we even, when we have to put a grinder wheel on the grinder itself, we want to make sure that grinder wheel is in good shape. And you do that by tapping it and hearing if it rings. If it has a ringing sound, it's a good grinding wheel, and it's okay to put on. But if you tap that wheel and it doesn't ring, it's a bad grinder wheel, and do not put it on there. They call that the ring test. We got to keep this work rest adjusted to 1/8 of an inch. The work rest is the bottom adjustment right here. And as that grinder wheel goes down from use, you have to continue to set that setting to 1/8 of an inch. And at some point, the wheel is going to get so small you can't maintain this setting, and that's when you know you need to change out the wheel. The work rest should be set at 1/8, and the top, which is called the tongue guard, should be set at 1/4. And what this does, if something breaks and gets inside of the grinder wheel, by having these settings in place, it won't allow that piece to projectile into the operator. It keeps it within the guard itself. So that's why we keep those settings in place. And we want to make sure that that grinder is also secured to the surface. Handheld grinders. Eye protection, hear protection, possibly wear gloves, depends on the manufacturer. But this is the main thing, is to make sure that little guard right there is always in place. I see that guard taken off everywhere I go. And you may even have grinders out there that do not have that particular guard on there. It might be time to get rid of that particular grinder and get a new one with that new guard on there. And again, just inspect your tools, see what you have, go through an inventory and update them to the current technology of guarding. Bender safety. There's all kinds of hazards associated with this particular piece of equipment, but the main one, again, is eye protection and keeping your body parts away from the tool. and the load. And of course, we don't want to use glass or plastic or anything that can splinter and fly out of the machine or shatter. We always want to keep our hands away from the die on the rollers when you're bending the pipe or the the steel. And if it's hydraulically powered, then we'll make sure that that capacity rating is never exceeded. So again, there's a lot of hazards associated. Probably not all, it's probably even more than what I have listed here. And again, if you have this in your shop, your people can help you get those hazards on a piece of paper, and you can start training and make sure everybody's aware of those. Welding. MIG and TIG welding. Now, MIG welding uses a continuous fed wire, whereas TIG welding just uses electrodes, but welding is welding. And anybody who welds should be trained and certified. We don't want just anybody to start welding. And we want to make sure that everybody's protected. And you got to wear welding gloves, helmets, aprons, chaps, shoes, eye protection. We want to make sure that we use the correct mask make sure our eyes don't burn. So there's just all kinds of associated protection in welding. We want to make sure we weld in well-ventilated areas so the fumes can be ventilated away from the person and not directly into the welder's face. We don't want to wear synthetic fiber clothing. We want to make sure that you wear natural clothing, because synthetic clothing will actually melt on the person. You want something that would not just stick to the skin if it melts. You want it to actually just burn. So we don't want to wear synthetic fiber. We want to avoid electrical shock. We want to make sure that the electrode holder and all electrical connections and cables are properly insulated, and check to see that the welder is properly grounded, and never weld in damp locations. That's for sure. We want to protect those welding cables. We want to keep those cables from coming in contact with the hot metal and sharp edges. We don't want to drive a truck over the cables or a forklift over the cables. And when welding, we want to try to avoid wrapping these electrode cables around the actual welder himself. We want to handle the hot metal with pliers or tongs. We don't want to do that with our hands, of course, and we will submerge them in water to prevent steam burns. We don't want to allow that electrode to stick. If the electrode does stick, so we want to cut off the switch and allow the electrode to cool and then break it loose. We want to prevent burns. Never allow the hot electrode or the holder to touch your bare skin. And again, there's just all kinds of association things that we want to make sure to prevent burns. Another thing about welding is the actual acetylene oxygen tank cylinders. You want to keep those secured. And you want, what I mean by that, if they're in your shop, they need to have a chain around them or a rope or something to keep them secure so they won't fall. If they're in your truck, you want to keep them secured so during transport they won't fall. So that is another thing you want to make sure you do. There's many, many other aspects of welding. I just named a few there that are some very important ones. I thought another thing that might be helpful is to talk about housekeeping. Housekeeping is where it all starts. If you don't have good housekeeping, you probably have a lot of incidents. So good housekeeping practices lends itself to a good, safe operation. So if you have poor housekeeping, it can lead to tripping over loose objects on the floor, stumbling over platforms, being hit by objects, slipping on grease and water in the floor, dirty surfaces, striking against projecting poorly stacked items, misplaced material, cutting and puncturing and tearing the skin. So you've got to maintain the workplace throughout a day, and proper housekeeping manages the orderly storage of movement of materials from the point of entry to exit. You know, you'll find if you have good housekeeping that it will also make you be more efficient, be safer, and we use within Glen Raven, we use something called 5S. 5S I have up here in the left-hand corner is basically sort, set in order, shine, standardize, and sustain. Basically what that means is go in and throw away the stuff that you don't use anymore, organize what you do have, label things, standardize it where everybody can find it. If they go to get a tool, the tool is there. If it's not there, you know where it is. But the hardest part about 5S is the last S, which is sustain. And that means just keeping it that way. It's pretty easy to get it organized one day. It's tough to keep it organized 365 days a year. So, but you will find that if you do that, if you really put good housekeeping practices in place, it will affect your safety program drastically. And these pictures just show some workshops. I've gone to many places and there'll be a cabinet, and I open the cabinet and it just pops open. There's about 40 brooms inside of it. We don't need 40 brooms. The top picture there shows a kind of like a tree that they hang like the dustpan, one broom on, and various other items that they use in a very orderly fashion. And that's all that in the area has. We don't have 40 brooms out in the workplace leaning against walls, being trip hazards and that type thing. And this other picture in the middle shows parts that have been labeled, so when you come to that shelf, you know exactly what is on that shelf and you can get that. You don't have to go through your toolbox for 15 minutes looking for a screw, looking for a washer, looking for whatever it is. And then just keeping a clean workshop lends itself to good safety practices. Ladder safety. I'm sure you use ladders. We all use ladders. We always want to face the ladder, whether while ascending and descending. And when placing your ladder against the ledge, always remember the 4-to-1 rule. For every 4 feet you climb, you should have the ladder out from the wall that amount of feet. So if it's 12 feet, you'd have the ladder out 3 feet. And we always want to maintain 3 points of contact, 2 hands and a foot, when you're climbing the ladder. We want to make sure that the ladder supporting feet are parallel and placed on a stable level surface. We all have seen pictures on the internet of ladders placed on top of crates, on top of pickup trucks, on top of all kinds of things. No, we don't want to do that. The bottom and top of the extension ladder must always be anchored. That's the extension ladder. Ladders must never be placed on items with unstable bases, just what I talked about. An extension ladder used to access an elevated surface must extend at least 3 feet above that ledge, as you can see by this picture on the left, and we don't want to exceed the load rating of the ladder. And now ladders should be on some type of inspection, weekly, monthly inspection, just to make sure they stay maintained. Fall protection. I told you we would talk more about that. I could have done an entire webinar on fall protection. So I'm just going to go over the basics with you. In general industry, if you are above 4 feet, you have to have fall protection. In construction, that same standard now becomes 6 feet. If you're at 6 feet or above, you've got to have fall protection. Now, fall protection can come in many forms. One of the forms is standard railing. If you're protected by standard railing, no fall for rest system is required. And the standard railing is shown by the picture in the top left. That means the top rail is at 42, the mid rail is at 21, and you have a toe board. If you have those configurations and on each side of somebody, you do not have to have a fall arrest system. If you're on a ladder, you do not have to have a fall arrest system. Now, if someone starts reaching out from the ladder, instead of being just within the ladder itself, I would say a ladder is not the best instrument to be used. Maybe you need to use a scissor lift, but if you're on the ladder, you do not have to wear a fall arrest system. If you're in a scissor lift doesn't require fall arrest if you stay on the floor surface of that scissor lift. But we experience sometimes with people climbing up on the railing of a scissor lift, and once they do that, they would have to have fall arrest protection. So we require fall arrest system on our scissor lifts. Bucket lifts require fall arrest system to be worn at all times. The picture there on the right is a bucket truck. As you can imagine, if you're riding alone in a bucket truck and hit a hole, that length of that arm and being out in that bucket would propel you off if it were to hit that hole. And so that's why it's required to have fall protection all the time. So if you're at 4 or 6 feet and you're not within a scissor lift, within standard railing, you would have to have a fall arrest. That would mean a harness, a lanyard, and a tile point designated for someone. And it just can't be any tile point. You would have to make sure that that tile is rated for the person's weight plus the falls, all that. So there's a lot of calculations around that. You probably have to get help from an engineer to calculate to make sure that. And just remember, all harnesses are not created equal. Some harnesses are made for like 150 to 200 pounds. Other harnesses are made for above that. So just make sure for the size of the person, make sure you got the appropriate harness. Again, I could talk a whole webinar just on fall protection, but this kind of gives you some idea around the requirements. I thought of some other safety concerns that you probably have to deal with, and one of the most hazardous things that we all do is drive. So if you have people who have to drive pickup trucks or company trucks or personal cars or trucks on company time, this is probably the most hazardous things that we do. So how do you make sure that your people, your company doesn't have much a liability when people are driving? Well, you need to do a motor vehicle record check on people, on your drivers, to make sure they're not out there driving without a valid driver's license, or making sure that they haven't been suspended driving, or they have multiple speeding tickets, or intoxicated driving, impaired driving. So we want to look at those motor vehicle records, and if they meet some criteria, they shouldn't drive. And so we also want to make sure that we have proper insurance coverage. And again, if you allow personal vehicle use on company time, you want to make sure that their personal coverage is, they have it. Because if they're in a personal vehicle, the first insurance that would be used would be their insurance, and then the company insurance as well. And then I'll oftentimes ask people, would you know what to do if you're in an auto accident? And because it's not something that happens all the time, it's not something we think about, what would we do? What do we tell our people? Who should they call? What insurance company should I call? Who should I call back at the shop? All those types of things. So that's a very important thing. But driving is the most hazardous thing we all do. Also, do you have a procedure or a protocol in place if an incident occurs, both at your shop and at a job site, off-site? What happens there? Do you go to the emergency room? How does that happen? Do you call 911? So there's a lot of things that need to be considered there. Do you have the appropriate workers' comp insurance? Do you have, when you go off job and install awnings, do you make sure you mark off that job site to make sure pedestrians don't enter? Do you try to make sure that tools and things such as that don't fall in areas that should and possibly hit pedestrians? So, and I would just always, in my mind, make sure there's always more than one person at a job site just to make sure that everybody's following the protocol. And I know in Glen Raven, we require all our contractors to have a certificate of insurance before they even start a job. And we go much more in detail in that. But I know that that's a requirement. And I bet that you have to provide that certificate of insurance as well. And if you use a contractor, best practice would be make sure that they have the proper insurance of coverage of liability and workers' comp and so forth. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan.
Well, thank you, Charles. Well, great job. You can really see the years of experience and what's a download of a lot of information. So thank you. At this time, I'd like to ask that anyone who has a question to submit it in the questions box. That questions box is on the right-hand corner of your screen, and you're welcome to type any questions that you have into it. And we do have a couple here, Charles, and we can get those started while people are typing any other questions that they've got. To kind of circle back to your slide on the job safety or job hazard assessment, is there a best practice that's recommended for implementing those JSAs, JHAs with staff in terms of, is that individual training, is that group training, is that employee manual, is that posting the JSAs on the wall? Is there a best practice?
You know, it's all going to be different for any organization. I can only speak from my experience. Number one, I'm all for the associates themselves help writing the JSAs. Let them be involved in telling what the hazards are that they're exposed to. And then as things occur, like I said, incidents, make sure that those incidents have been covered in the JSA. And then at least once a year, I would cover that JSA with each associate. It can be in a group setting. It could be one-on-one, but definitely it can be used for a new employee. What a wonderful training tool to provide a new associate to read through and then see in action as an experienced associate performs those tasks so that they can get a good awareness of the hazards. Especially in the young people of today, we want to make sure that they understand there's no shortcuts in our business for sure. So I would say it really depends on the organization. You can do it many ways, but that's what I would recommend.
Okay, good. I mean, do you recommend that you have the employees sign off on these somehow to show that they've been trained and dated, or is that already on the form?
I think it's always a great idea to document that the JSA was covered initially and then annually. I would have some type of sign sheet that shows that individual was made aware and that he agrees with what's on the JSA.
Great, thank you. Comments here are, I noticed that several times during your presentation you stated an associate must be deemed certified or competent. Who or what determines if a person is competent?
Competent, certified, those words, sometimes people interpret that to mean you got to go get a degree or you got to get a certification at a school or something like that. I want to make sure that you understand that the employer deems somebody competent or certified by their experience, by the work that they do. And it may be that they do have education in that particular task, like a welder. Maybe they have gone to a community college and learned welding. But ultimately, the employer deems somebody as being competent.
Okay, and we've got another question here. What do you view or see as being the most important aspect of safety?
Oh, that's easy. That's getting your associates involved into the safety. Don't let it be just driven by management. Make sure that the associates are involved in safety. They're part of the solution. They look out for each other. They are the safety program themselves, not management. They understand, like JSAs, they understand the hazards. They understand why they have to wear PPE. They're not made to, they want to, because of the atmosphere and culture that you've created in your workplace. So the secret sauce to safety is employer-associate involvement.
Well, great. I'm sure people have got a lot of other questions as they digest all of this, but we're coming up here at the end of our hour program. So I think at this point, what we'll do is just say thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in this afternoon. And Charles, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and really the amount of really great information that you shared. So we really appreciate it. PAMA has a lineup of webinars for the next several months, so please do stay tuned for details about our next webinar. And at this point, we'll conclude this webinar by saying I hope everybody has a good afternoon and be safe. Thank you.